Chapter 1 Introduction. A short story is like a time capsule. It records in a fashion that cannot be easily understood until some considerable time has passed. Very specific details of how the author's life was being lived when the words were set down. An excerpt from the collected edition of Clive Barker's Books of Blood. Let's crack open this time capsule, shall we? Who is Clive, or who was Clive, and what was the world like at the time of writing Midnight Meat Train? To begin with, if you are familiar with Barker beyond his colossal presence as a horror legend, both as a writer and a director, I think it would have to be his notable status as an LGBT icon. He's also a terrific painter in my opinion. Quote, Clive Barker grew up in Liverpool and worked in theater for several years there and in London. In 1981, he became interested in horror, and in 18 months wrote the 250,000 words that would become Clive Barker's Books of Blood, Volumes 1 through 3, 1984. Frankly, in 1981, there would be plenty of things to be terrified of. Both the UK and the US swung to the right. Margaret Thatcher became the UK's leader in 1979, and Ronald Reagan became the US president in 1981. This coincided with Lee Atwater's confession of the Southern Strategy, strategic racism implemented by the American Republican Party for roughly 2 decades before his confession. In June 1981, the virus now known as HIV/AIDS would make itself known. The CDC calculated that an estimated 47,993 people died of the virus under Reagan's presidency alone. If one was looking to write a horror story in the 80s, just 1 year in, and there was no lack of inspiration to draw from. Barker's status as a gay man would be more widely known following an August '96 appearance on Loveline, a radio call-in show. However, he would state that he never made his sexuality a secret in the first place. Whether the masses knew of the author's sexuality before the call-in or not, he had almost certainly directly faced, or at least witnessed, the choking smog of anti-LGBT sentiment during the time leading up to Books of Blood's publishing. A poison that hasn't quite left our lungs, might I add. Between June 2022 and April 2023, the ADL and GLAAD documented at least 356 anti-LGBTQ+ acts motivated by hate, both by extremists and non-extremists in the US alone. That's nearly a hate act per day of the year, and these are only the ones that got reported. It's important to note that acts in this case are defined as vandalism of property, harassment, assault, and direct online harassment. The report does not include anti-LGBTQ+ legislation. According to the Human Rights Campaign, a record 520 anti-LGBTQ+ bills have been introduced into the state legislature as of May 2023. In producing the first volume of Books of Blood, Clive's publisher strongly suggested he change the couple in The Hills the Cities from a homosexual relationship to a hetero one. An author's political anxieties often subconsciously or consciously seep into their writing, adding emotional depth and meaning to the story. Barker does not shy away from discussing the impact of politics on his work. In my research for the video, I have found that alongside the typical questions you'd expect an interviewer to ask a horror author, such as why he writes horror, his process, his next project, etc., he has also asked quite a few questions about his personal life and politics. He has publicly debated homophobic Christians on Bill Maher's Politically Incorrect, condemned fellow author J.K. Rowling for her public meltdowns over trans folk, and discussed his discontent with the concept of complacency for social progress in a podcast, Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. As for Midnight Meat Train, Barker has been open about the real-life inspiration for the story. Though he grew up in Liverpool, he moved to Los Angeles, California in 1991. Before this move, he visited America multiple times, with the inspiration for Midnight Meat Train coming from one solo trip to New York when he was mistakenly delivered to the end of the line, a dark empty station. Chapter 2 Summary. Leon Kaufman recently relocated to the city of his dreams, New York. He even has a nickname for it that makes my skin crawl for some reason. The Palace of Delights. He's been in the Big Apple, an equally silly name, for 3.5 months. Not an awful long time, but enough time for him to become disillusioned with the city he supposedly loved so much. Quote, love? Never. It had been at best an infatuation. And now, after only 3 months living with his object of adoration, spending his days and nights in her presence, she had lost her aura of perfection. New York was just a city. He had seen her wake in the morning like a slut, and pick murdered men from beneath her teeth, and suicides from the tangles of her hair. He had seen her late at night, her dirty back streets shamelessly courting depravity. He had watched her in the hot afternoon, sluggish and ugly, indifferent to the atrocities that were being committed every hour in her throttled passages. In the few months Leon had lived in New York City, there had been talk of corpses found beneath the streets and the subway. The tragedy became premium watercolor talk stock around the office, labeled the subway slaughter. Lifeless bodies were cleaned to an almost professional degree, shaved, plucked, piercings removed, hung upside down, and bled dry. So professional, in fact, that the police were questioning every butcher in the area. Despite the city deciding to keep the press quiet about the situation, that did nothing to suppress the swell of rumors. Ultimately, someone leaked the info to a reporter at the Times. After picking up a copy of the Times, Kaufman was so disgusted he decided to shove his plate of eggs aside. There was no time to meditate on the day's headline when a bearded, disheveled man bumped into him and his coffee. An attempt was made to soak up the coffee, as the stranger droned on about the murders being part of a conspiracy that's being covered up. Something about clones, and the cops being in on it. However, Kaufman felt this kind of talk. No, this kind of man was beneath him. This is a good time to mention that the story is written from an alternating point of view between that of Leon and the subway slaughterer. I don't really want to talk about the movie adaptation too much, mostly because I think that it falls short, and this is one of the aspects that it cuts. Having seen the movie and read the story, I prefer the alternating POV. It follows both characters doing relatively mundane tasks culminating in the only way that it could. Then it hits you with the world-shattering twist. It may come off as peculiar to describe a killer's actions as mundane, but largely he carries out the actions in a very matter-of-fact way, mirroring Kaufman's day job. Axing the alternating POV is just one example of how the movie is less coherent. This writing style practically begs us to draw comparisons between the two characters. Mahogany sleeps till 6, awakes to a leaky apartment, and looks down on the citizens of New York, both literally and figuratively. After all, they were simply shuffling home after some soul-sucking day job, while he had a much greater purpose, or so he thought anyways. Mahogany fancies himself an expert, with an extraordinary purpose in life. Yet time stops for no man, and he had had a few slip-ups, especially recently. Aging made the job more difficult, and he was struggling to keep up. Is it time to pass on the skills of the trade? Who would take his place? Kaufman still sat alone at his desk. The clock read 7:16 now, the building nearly empty besides a few cleaning ladies. Alone with the sandwich, he'd sworn to be out of there no later than 10 o'clock. Meanwhile, Mahogany was ready for a night out on the town. After all, he had business to attend. He'd arrive at the subway at 9 o'clock, scoping out his fellow travelers, still ruminating on his aging and what his masters might do if he failed once more. On his stakeout, he came across an issue of the New York Post. Police all out to catch killer. A smile etched itself across his face. Quote, after all, wasn't his career sanctioned by the highest possible authorities? No policeman could hold him. No court could pass judgment on him. Even by 11, Leon wasn't out of his corporate confinement. Eyes burnt red from a day spent hunched over his desk. Fuck it, he proclaimed, venturing out into the cold. Unbeknownst to both men, the police would have their hands tied, apprehending who they believed to be the subway killer. A small man who was threatening a woman with a knife. 15 minutes after leaving work, he finally boarded the train. After that, it would only take 35 minutes for him to get home. It had been a long day, longer than anticipated, so long in fact that it was starting to catch up with him. Though he fell asleep in the cabin with a young boy and a middle-aged woman, he would wake up alone. Did he miss his stop? Fuck it, he muttered to himself as he went to leave his seat. His concern was quickly quelled for the time being, as the train pulled to its next stop, West 4th Street to be exact, letting him know that he hadn't missed any stops during his nap. This sense of relief would soon evaporate, however, as after hearing a tearing sound coming from the other car, curiosity would get the best of him. Inching closer to the door, Kaufman finds himself standing in a pool of blood. A weak stomach would get the better of him, causing him to faint. Upon awakening under one of the seats, he had no way of knowing how long he had been out. The door opened and footsteps shattered nerves with every step. Mahogany makes his way towards the head cabin, Kaufman full of dread. Thinking the driver would soon be killed, new worlds of despair opened up to him when he realized the two were engaged in small talk. The driver's in on it. As the two men joke, the stowaway crawls under the rows of seats and makes his way to the door. Into the next car, Kaufman is now face to face with death. Rows of corpses hung upside down in front of him, completely bare and gently swinging. Crossing the urban river Styx, light dissipates from the cart. Stumbling around the carnage, slamming into bodies, he can't help but to let out a scream. Once more, light returned to the cart. Kaufman knew at this point the only possibility was confrontation, as the echoes of the butcher's footsteps filled the room. In a frantic search for some kind of one-up on the killer, he settles on a large knife that belonged to one of the victims. Brandishing the blade, he stared down the hall, eye to eye with the killer. Sure, he had ended lives, probably countless times, but it wasn't the face of a murderer. He looked like any other bald, out of shape, middle-aged man. Mahogany swings his cleaver, however Kaufman takes a step backwards, and the cleaver lodges itself into one of the hanging bodies. This most likely would be the only chance he'd get, an opportunity he would seize. Leon plunged the knife into the assailant's neck, a fatal wound, blood spewing from both sides of his neck. The butcher was dead, a traumatic wreck, understandably so. Kaufman passed out once more. Awakened with no sense of how much time had passed, the train slowly came to a stop. stop. A voice came crackling over the intercom. "We're here, man. Better take your place." The train was completely engulfed in darkness. The rest of his senses would not be as lucky as his vision, however, as following a hiss of the air pressure releasing in the door, the gaping portal left behind let in a foul odor. Standing there with his hand clasped over his nose and mouth, waiting for what comes next. A faint whispering would soon surround the train. Taking refuge at one of the seats, Kaufman did not have the energy to do much more than watch on. Even so, where would he go? The humanoids started to board the car. They were not terribly gruesome. In fact, they were rather quite frail. Quote, "They were completely bald. The tired flesh of their faces was pulled tight over their skulls so that it shone with tension. There were stains of decay and disease on their skin, and in places the muscle had withered to black pus, through which the bone of the cheek or the temple was showing. Some of them were naked as babies, their pulpy synthetic bodies scarcely sexed. What had been breasts were leathery bags hanging off the torso, the genitalia shrunken away. Quote, worse sights than the naked among them were those who wore a veil of clothing. It soon dawned on Kaufman that the rotting fabric slung around their shoulders or knotted around their midriffs was made of human skin. Not one, but a dozen or more, heaped haphazardly on top of each other like pathetic trophies. The creatures then reached towards the meal prepared in front of them, flicking their tongues, eyes full of glee. Eventually an entity stopped with a face of curiosity towards the stowaway. Quote, "You came after the other, yes? You must now do this for us," it said through the bestial grin. "We cannot survive without food." "It disgusts us no less than you," said the creature. "But we are bound to eat this meal, or we die. God knows I have no appetite for it. We are the city fathers," the thing said, "and mothers and daughters and sons. The builders, the lawmakers. We made this city before you were born, before anyone living was born. You must do this for us, and for those older than us, for those born before the city was thought of, when America was a timberland and a desert." The creature raised a hand, signaling out past the train. The rest of the pack parted for their new delivery boy. Following the trail their departure made for him, he laid eyes on their ancient relative. Quote, "It was giant, without head or limb, without a feature that was analogous to human, without an organ that made sense or senses. If it was like anything, it was like a shoal of fish. 1,000 snouts all moving in unison, budding, blossoming, and withering, rhythmically. It was iridescent, like a mother of pearl, but it was something deeper than any color Kaufman knew, or could put a name to. That was all Kaufman could see, and it was more than he wanted to see. There was much more in the darkness, flickering and flapping." The father reaches out for Kaufman, grabbing him by the face. "Serve," he said, in silence. The creature plucked the man's tongue out, as if it was a pesky weed. The ancient ones departed the train, back into the darkness, leaving the man on the floor gargling his own blood. With the new recruit passed out, once again the train takes off. The train now at its destination, the driver woke the man from his slumber. "You got a job to do, my man. They're very pleased with you." The driver had licked his fingers and was rubbing Kaufman's swollen lips, trying to part them. Lots to learn before tomorrow night. The driver brought the new hire to his station. Solid white tile, no pedestrians, no gates, no toll booth. It was unlike anything the man had seen. The cleaning crew was there to hose down the train. The engineman smiled and introduced the butcher's successor. Quote, the workers looked at Kaufman. There was a certain deference in their faces, which he found appealing. The driver led Kaufman up the stairs back to the city, per his request. Quote, the city would go about its business in ignorance, never knowing what it was built upon or what it owed its life to. Without hesitation, Kaufman fell to his knees and kissed the dirty concrete with his bloody lips, silently swearing his eternal loyalty to its continuance. Chapter 3, Conclusion. The big twist in Midnight Meat Train is that the Butcher's murders are to some degree being covered up, and that they are in a way sanctioned by a higher being, a series of entities the general population would never understand. One thing I find particularly intriguing is the fact that we don't know exactly how far the conspiracy spreads. We know for sure at least some of the subway workers are in on it, like the driver and the cleaning crew. But what about the police officers, the politicians? We can't be certain how many people it takes to keep the moving parts of the murder machine greased. To me, this furthers the themes of disillusionment and power found in the story. The first page tells us that Leon is disillusioned with the whole city. We spend some time with him at his dead-end job where he works overtime, alone. And this is not to mention that as far as we know, Kaufman has no personal ties of any kind. He doesn't mention a single friend, family member, partner, or even a pet. This man may as well be a ghost walking in the streets. Not to say that it's impossible to be alone and happy, but Leon Kaufman is not a happy man. We see this in the way that he conceptualizes the city and its peoples. Similarly, the Butcher envisions himself as above those who walk the streets below him. He's arrogant, anti-Semitic, and something of a coward. As we follow him, his recent failures have him worried that the ones he serves will do away with him, yet he revels in taking others' lives. Kaufman and Mahogany, to me, are very much two sides of the same coin. Both men are very arrogant and have this air of superiority about them, looking down on those who they see as lesser, and both men spend their lives filling these very corporate roles where they most certainly won't be missed and are easily replaced. We know very little about Leon's job, so it's not certain whether he was instructed to stay at the office so late. However, he was the only one there, so it leads me to believe that it could be from some sense of duty, not unlike that the Butcher feels. A power that Mahogany believes elevates him above the law and makes him invincible. We know this not to be true. A pair of his would-be victims sent him to the hospital prior to the story. B, he is killed by Leon with little fanfare. Why does Kaufman agree to take the job? Well, I suspect it's partially due to cowardice. Kaufman is completely alienated from the city he lives in and the people in that city. He can't set clear boundaries when it comes to work, and he passes out at the first sight of blood. Also, Kaufman doesn't really have a voice. He finds the man at the diner detestable, but he can't bring himself to say anything, even when the man berates the waitress over something the man caused. Now Leon is both metaphorically and physically silent, after the father's removed his tongue. Yet after very little time, he is full of pride because the cleaning crew acknowledged him. It has to be a false sense of power. I'm skeptical that the cleaning guys are very impressed with him, and why should they be? He managed to overpower an aging man. Leon is outnumbered, greatly so by the creatures, and I have no doubt that they could find someone else to do their bidding. However, with them being described as geriatric, I have to wonder what it would take to stage a rebellion against them. If the ancient fathers died, would the city not still stand? I don't have an answer to this. I don't think we are supposed to. I do think that these are the questions we are supposed to have. A sort of how many of us would it take to halt the machine type of thing. Because it would be just as easy for the monsters to be written as beyond us in power, like one of the creatures from a Lovecraft story. But they aren't. The humanoid ones are weak, and even the Eldritch one seems to be stuck and helpless. They only survive through the aid of man. So that leads me to believe that change is possible. Maybe that's the point. Either way, Kaufman took the devil's deal and will keep the meat grinder going, only to be replaced like he replaced the guy before him. A system of violence that will continue until someone stops feeding the ghouls that keep the thing going. I think a fairly appropriate way to end this video is with an excerpt from an interview I found on Clive's website about endings. Quote, I think of my stories as having happy endings perversely enough, because they often end with scenes of revelation of some kind or another, characters understanding themselves and realizing they need fresh meaning in their lives. Even if that meaning is called Rawhead Rex, is 9 feet tall, and is likely to tear your head off, which occasionally happens. Even so, there is meaning, and there are new ways of looking at themselves in relation to their own subconscious. In Midnight Meat Train, Kaufman's a real marginal, a disenfranchised accountant whose life doesn't mean anything until he realizes there are greater forces at work than he'd ever thought. And there, I think, is a story with a perfect happy ending. He goes through hell and he comes through the other side, utterly changed, utterly transformed. At the end of The Hills, the Cities, both protagonists die, but they gain meaning, extraordinary meaning. Perhaps not a meaning that one would want to celebrate. It's ambiguous. But when they see the beast in the hills, some new vision is presented to them, which hitherto they wouldn't even have been capable of imagining. I very much like the ambiguity, or the ambivalence, of a moment which can be terrible and significant simultaneously. The way that many of the pivotal moments in our lives are very often rites of passage moments in which things are lost, which can never be claimed again. Yet the territory ahead is, by the virtue of the fact that it's new, also exciting and extraordinary. I wanted to give a special thanks to anyone who's made it to my side of the wasteland, my incredible partner for doing all my channel art, and my cats for keeping me company while I worked on this.